Roberto A. Almodobar. Exactly 6,656 words. P.O. Box 1661. First North American Serial Rights, Klamath Falls, Oregon, 97601. Copyright 2010 Roberto A. Almodobar, ralmodobar@gmail.com. Emma by Roberto Almodobar. Why am I so tormented by this loathing? Prologue. Letter from inmate Catherine Cinnamon, August 2010, Santa Rita Women's Federal Correctional Facility, California. Dear JT, I can't believe it, 30 more days after 25 years and I'm out. I'm an old gal now, the streets won't be too kind, but I'm sure I'll find something to help me. I've done just like you asked these last few years, have been really good, finally learned to read and write pretty well in here. I got my GED. I wanted to say thank you for being my friend, I look forward to meeting you one day. Regards, K. Cinnamon. 1. From a bird's eye view, a layer of mist coated the countryside as far as the eye could see beneath it. Tall redwoods flourished, clinging on mountainous hills and canyons that rolled for miles, ending at the California coast and the beginning of the Pacific Ocean. The private panhandle stretched for nearly a mile, wild, for the exception of a gated access road winding from the main road up to the Hiller House itself, sitting atop the edge of the world. The Hiller House was a three-storied painted lady with Queen Anne-styled exteriors modeled after several California Victorian estates. The east side of the house faced the private driveway, the west side with its beautiful gables and two stunning Queen Anne towers faced out toward the Pacific, offering an ultimate ocean view and gorgeous sunsets. Further below to the south could be seen the small coastal town of Jenner by the sea, and the Russian River emptying into the ocean. David Martin peered down from his third-story window through the morning mist. He could see the entrance and driveway, watched as Big Jake brought the car up to the front door. Emma was back. Doors opened upward and downward from the stretched limo, forming a ramp to the sidewalk, and from inside emerged Emma Hiller, sitting in her $100,000 custom-designed transport chair. A self-contained high-tech traveling office with an added touch sporting gold-plated Benz hubcaps to match the limo. Trotting beside Emma were her ever-faithful companions, Max and Kilo, two monstrous Doberman pinschers. Jesus Christ, Jake, they didn't wash the windows, screeched Emma. Didn't I tell you to make sure they washed the goddamned windows? Jake got out of the limo and cringed. He took a look at the large, relatively clean-looking windows. They hadn't been power washed that morning as planned. Real sorry, I'll find out what the trouble is, replied Jake. It might be a scheduling issue. I'll talk to Arlene. It's a very simple request, Jake, continued Emma. They take a bucket, some water, soap, and a rag. I wanted to see clean windows when I got back. How fucking hard is that? If the help you hire can't get the job done, maybe you should wash them yourself. David listened as Emma ranted and raged about the windows, lashing out at Jake as she zipped down the ramp and up the walkway into the house. Jake didn't need to glance up at the Queen Anne-styled tower and attic windows. He knew David would be watching. It was during these brief painful moments when both men seemed to respect each other at the hands of Emma. Jake never let it show, but David guessed he would give Emma the back of his hand, or worse if Jake could get away with it, because he himself felt the same way sometimes. David shook his head and smiled, looking down with a huge grin, shaking his head from the window with a thumbs-up sign. It was always nice to see he wasn't the only victim to Emma's constant bickering and bitterness, sometimes cruel treatment of her staff. Even her most trusted servant, bodyguard, and driver Big Jake was fair game. David figured she was paying him more than enough to put up with her bullshit all these years. The staff was nowhere to be found, and when Jake discovered that Emma had let them all go a day early and didn't tell him, he wanted to scream. The windows had been calendared for that very morning of her arrival and would have been done, sparkling clean. Ah yes, my tall black friend, the best laid plans. She fucked you again. David chuckled to himself, watching from above, knowing there would be problems when Emma let the entire staff go a day early for her annual self-imposed 2-week sabbatical. David had to laugh. Washing windows wasn't in his job description. He didn't bring up that concern to Jake, because he assumed Jake would have known, or if he'd known about it perhaps didn't give a shit and didn't do windows either. Jake finally looked up and responded with a smile and a middle finger. "Just take care of my dogs while I'm away," he snarled, glaring up at the tower window. David smiled, reading his lips, then turned back to his computer with a frown. "Fuck you and your dogs." Of all the staff in the house, Big Jake garnered the most respect. David and others had witnessed firsthand over the years what he was capable of doing with his bare hands. Jake was a professional bodyguard, capable of extreme violence, an expert marksman, licensed to carry a concealed firearm, but with his 6'8" height and perfectly chiseled muscular body along with mastery of the martial arts, he never had to discharge any of his weapons in the service of Emma. The death threats she received were nothing compared to the desperate paparazzi hounding her for a good photo. He'd quickly broken more than one photographer's hands and or arms and many noses trying to shove cameras in her face over the years, and they understood the consequences of getting too close to her. For the most part, Big Jake was soft-spoken and polite, mostly keeping to himself when off duty, but otherwise never more than a few feet away from Emma. 2. David had secretly tapped into the house silent security systems months ago. It gave him access to the same 54 micro-sized hidden cameras and microphones throughout the main house and guest house located next door. The system also allowed the monitoring of approaching vehicles from anywhere on the property half-mile down to the main gate. He watched through a succession of ground cameras as Big Jake parked the limo. His huge bulk unfolded from the front seat and walked around to the side yard. David could see he was checking the kennels for food and water before getting in his own SUV and driving away. One thing David was certain of: no matter how much abuse Emma dished out, Big Jake, loyal to the end, would never let anything happen to her while he was alive and employed to protect her. 15 years ago, Emma Hiller was a 45-year-old single, mysterious and stunningly beautiful woman who happened to be worth hundreds of millions. Her inheritance and beauty easily allowed her to establish a career first as a supermodel, and later in business with cosmetics and commercial endorsements. A previous failed marriage that her beauty, wealth, and power couldn't prevent caused her to begin dating and being seen with younger, less powerful men she could easily control and discard. David Martin was a young, handsome 18-year-old model auditioning for a photo shoot for one of her cosmetic lines featuring two young lovers. Emma had been reviewing the top 100 candidate images brought to her by her editors when she spotted his set of photos. Diligently she carefully went through all 100 and made her final pick for the shoot. David Martin was perfect. He stood out of all the images. His stunning athletic build and chiseled features would be the type of guy any girl in the world could get wearing her cosmetics. Emma smiled. It wasn't going to be David Martin for the shoot, but he was going to be hers. David was still in his first year of junior college, using his good looks to help pay the bills. Thanks to a mother who pushed him into talent shows, dancing competitions and modeling, his agent finally started getting him jobs. Thinking back, he wished he'd never agreed to marry Emma. She practically paid off his parents, who were awed by her fame and fortune, and for him it had become a fairy tale come true. He dropped out of college and did photo shoots all over the world and got to appear in hundreds of ads and TV spots, but Emma kept him close and secretly conspired that he never reached that supermodel status. She convinced him he didn't need the fame or money, she would take care of him and he wouldn't have to worry for the rest of his life. Modeling was hard, grueling work. Hanging out with Emma seemed the better choice, and he quickly lost his interest in modeling. As time began to pass, after 15 years with all her money and power, she couldn't change the fact that time was catching up to both of them. He was 35 now and she was 60. What a fucking joke, David said to himself, watching her zip into the house, disappearing from view. He closed his eyes. He couldn't believe there was a time when she was beautiful and kind, a time when he couldn't wait to see her standing in the bedroom just waiting for him, a time when he really loved her and the money didn't matter so much. But that was 10 years ago, before the accident that changed both of their lives forever. Lately he loathed waking up to her. She looked older than she was, and repeated facelifts over the years started to take their toll. To make matters worse, at 60 her looks started to remind him of his grandmother. Why did he stay with her? He asked himself year after year. Could it be he still loved her, or was it the house with its 20-acre grounds? Perhaps it was the private Learjet they had taken many vacations on, or the cruises aboard their private yacht. He had traveled around the world many times with Emma, but he supposed in the end it really was the money. He didn't know her total worth. It was well known she was worth several billion, so staying with Emma was the price necessary to stay wealthy and never having to work a day in his adult life. That price had become very expensive the day Emma fell down the staircase and crushed her spine. It would be his misfortune and everyone around her that she survived the fall. She would spend the next decade seeking out the most talented spinal surgeons in the world, but could never face the same answer, the fact that she would never walk again. Her injury had been so severe their master bedroom suite on the third floor had been completely converted for Emma's exclusive needs, and David moved into the suite next door. David wanted the wall opened up so he could always be near, but Emma didn't want him to see her so helpless and refused. The years that followed turned her kindness to resentment, jealousy, hate, and finally anger. Over the last few years she vented more and more of her anger at him and anyone else who happened to be in range, and he slowly searched his soul for some profitable way out of his dilemma. David. The one soothing voice of his dream lady, now cold and unfeeling, cackled from the intercom. She wasn't home 2 minutes, still in the elevator, and already calling him like his mother used to. He closed his eyes, his heart starting to pound. Fuck. What did she want now? He switched off the monitor and carefully climbed down the ladder from his converted attic, the one place in the house Emma couldn't reach, all the while his mind formulating a plan. Emma Hiller sat up in her electric chair as the elevator door opened to her bedroom. Her eyes were wide with fury as her young, unbroken, unwrinkled husband entered the room. I know you went into town last night, David. She snapped at him, her eyes now blazing. I can't leave this goddamned house for one night without you sneaking off, she said, cocking her head to one side. David stared at the crow's feet around her eyes. They deepened and pulsated when she was in a rage. Her once beautiful features had transformed over the years, worsened since the accident. She never really looked as good the day he first met her by the pool and that first night they spent together. She was a 10 back then, blonde, blue eyes, perfect. Those were good memories, and the thought brought a slight smile to his lips. What's so goddamn funny? She blurted, ruining the moment. Do you think I don't know about your filthy little bitches in town? The images of happier times disappeared as he stared at her old and haggard sitting form. Well, I've had enough of that, she continued, followed by laughter. I filed for divorce, you ungrateful bastard. What are you began David. Don't interrupt me, she screeched loudly, zipping around the room, pulling an envelope from her briefcase. It's over, my young lover, she said more calmly, waving, then throwing it on the bed. Open it, she said. He approached slowly, sat on the bed and opened the envelope. Not to his surprise, inside were a half-dozen close-up and detailed photos of him with other women. Emma was finally going to cut him off. The most he could hope for was a few meager millions of dollars, mostly because of the prenuptial. He had almost $10 million in his own savings, but that wasn't going to be quite enough, unfortunately. My God, he said, getting up, almost whispering, it's nobody's fault you can't walk down those runways anymore, Emma, he said. You should be happy you had the chance to dazzle the world with your good looks. You've built an empire. Be happy that you have had more of everything than most people in the world could ever hope to think of, he continued, gazing into her once beautiful, caring eyes, and you didn't have to turn into a raging bitch the day you broke your back. David watched her rage intensify. She hated being lectured to. Don't change the subject, she screeched, tears streaming down her cracked face. You cheated on me, you bastard. They mean nothing to me, Emma. I have to pay them to love me, he continued. But you stopped loving me years ago, and won't let me near. You started acting like an angry stepmother instead of my wife. I've become your pet and prisoner instead of your husband, and you treat everyone around you like shit, so what do you expect? Get the hell out of here, you bastard, she screamed. Get out, and take these dogs with you, they need to be fed. You have 30 days to move the fuck out of my house, the sooner the better. Just take care of my dogs while I'm away. David suddenly remembered Big Jake's words. David stared down at the two large Doberman monsters lying uncomfortably alert at the foot of the brass bed, Max and Kilo. They both stared at him intensely with cold, wide-eyed, fearless silence. They were used to Emma's rants, but he couldn't as much raise his voice to the old bag without both those animals taking notice, and lately she had them with her all the time. He hated them as much as he now hated her. Max was the larger of the two monsters, and out behind the main house was Big Jake's kennel. In the kennels lived 10 more versions of Max and Kilo. They were the ground dogs. David looked down into Emma's raging face, moved closer to her and gently whispered in her ear, "Before you evict me, my love," he began, "before you try to have me sign any divorce papers, I would like to know if you've heard from Catherine lately." Emma stared back at David with a scowl. "Catherine? Catherine who?" "How about Cinnamon, does that name ring a bell?" asked David. Emma forced a smile. "You stupid fuck, is this your miserable attempt at some sort of blackmail? This is over for you, I want you out of here tomorrow," screeched Emma. "I can't wait for tomorrow," David quickly thought to himself as he stared at the dogs. "Come on, boys," he said, motioning to them, "let's eat." Both dogs looked at Emma anxiously, waiting for her approval. "Oh, go on," she said impatiently with a frown, waving them away with her hands while trying to stop her tears. Once David left her room, Emma turned a pale white and her heart raced. She burst into tears. She tried not to panic. There was no way David could know about Catherine or Cinnamon. Big Jake was the only other person who knew those names, and even he didn't know what they really meant, and she was certain no reason for Jake to mention it. But somehow David knew the names. A tremor traveled down Emma's broken spine. Could he then know everything? She couldn't risk it. 3. Max and Kilo quickly got up and followed David downstairs to the kitchen and pantry. Only during feeding time did the massive dogs transform from cold-eyed monsters to happy, normal dogs, whining, with their stubby little tails wagging furiously, waiting to be fed. As dangerous and ferocious as these particular dogs were, he couldn't help but laugh as both monsters spun on the kitchen floor like real dogs did when they were hungry. "Hungry, huh?" he said, reaching down for the large cans of hearty bits. "I'll bet the two of you fuckers and your brothers out there could eat a horse in a couple of days, huh?" He paused a moment at his last remark as he subconsciously read the contents in the can. Ingredients: chicken liver, beef stock, eggs, ground white rice, cornstalk. Suddenly he glanced upstairs with a smile on his face, then turned his gaze back to the can. "Hearty bits, with chunks of meat so tender and real your dog might think it's dreaming." David couldn't hold back the urge to laugh. The hungry solutions to his problems stood in front of him as a sense of unhinged humor bubbled through his soul. He glanced out the kitchen window to the side yard beyond the brick-lined barbecue pit, and reflected on the immaculate kennels which could hold 12 separate dogs in luxurious accommodations. "Hearty bits my ass," he said, glancing back down at the can, grinning, then laughed as he glanced again at the red brick barbecue pit. Max gave a yipe, reminding him they were hungry. He looked down at the two ridiculous Dobermans doing their bullshit dog dance, little stubs wagging. "Sit," he commanded as they both immediately sat staring at him intensely, little stubs wagging a mile a minute. He laughed out loud until his ribs hurt and tears flowed from his eyes, and quickly it turned into a sinister, insane type of laughter. The killing turned out to be nasty business indeed. It wasn't the noise he was worried about. Big Jake along with the servants were off for the 1 week of the year that she dismissed all her extra help, keeping David as her personal miserable slave. He certainly didn't have to worry about the security guard at the main gate a half-mile away, and no one could have heard Emma's screams, the house being so far off the main road. He had programmed the indoor house security cameras to replay previously recorded images of an empty house, and as for Max and Kilo, they were now safely locked down in the pantry. When Emma zipped out of the elevator into the kitchen holding her Glock pistol, it surprised her that the kitchen floor was covered in plastic and she hesitated. A loud pop and David got her first, but the one quick shot to the heart didn't work like it did in the movies. Emma clutched her chest, she fired one shot that missed before dropping the pistol. "You motherfucking bitch," he blurted, panting, "you were going to kill me," he screeched. David tried to make it quick and painless for her, she just wouldn't die easy. Instead, a fountain of crimson emerged from her chest, followed by a wild, thrashing, bloodied affair. He stepped back to avoid the blood and shot her twice more before she finally went limp and stopped struggling in her chair, a dark red viscous pool growing at her feet. Even then it seemed an eternity until her labored, raspy panting finally ended. He stood there in silence and could see the blood pumping out of her until her heart finally stopped and she wasn't moving anymore. "Emma. My God," he blurted, trembling wildly, adrenaline flowing through his veins like a river out of control. He dropped the gun, running to the nearby bathroom, and heaved his guts out. "Fuck," he blurted to himself, tears streaming down his face, his knees shaking wildly. "I shot her, I fucking shot her." Emma tried to kill him first, but shooting her 3 times, even self-defense couldn't guarantee his freedom or the millions of dollars he looked forward to. Still, it took him hours to come to grips with the murder and finish his plan. From cleaning the room of the mess and bodily fluids released at death, to wrapping, then wheeling her body to one of the guest room showers. It really was a nasty business, and only the beginning of the horror. He carefully unwrapped her from the plastic, then undressed her, after he placed her body into the lavish tub shower. With his sleeves rolled up while kneeling down, he turned on the shower, waited for the soothing spray of hot water, then carefully sliced her belly open, remembering a careful lesson he learned while hunting and butchering deer. After managing to remove her organs and drain her bodily fluids, he fished out the 3 bullets. Happy that none of the meat was ruined, he started butchering her while storing portions in the kitchen walk-in freezer. He brought out large portions at a time to the kitchen and prepared the meat after firing up the gas barbecue. For the next week all 12 dogs gorged themselves and ate well, especially Max and Kilo. At first David supposed they might wonder where their absent master was. He couldn't help but chuckle. Several times during the course of a day the 2 dogs seemed to search the house looking for her, whimpering as they did. If Dobermans were capable of expressing sadness, Max and Kilo were a great act, but when feeding time approached twice, sometimes 3 times a day, they quickly transformed into 2 sporadic friendly poodles. Lately the pickings were great, and soon they seemed to forget all about Emma. They came to depend on him as the days passed, and he decided they weren't so bad after all. David began to wonder why Emma would want to kill him. He never expected the reaction she had hearing the names of Cinnamon and Catherine. Those were names she blurted out in her sleep and meant nothing to him. Obviously it was something Emma was willing to kill for. This was unexpected and he needed to find out why. David figured it might take a few days for Emma to pass through the dogs, so he cleaned the cages and burned the feces to ashes, and bagged them. 2 days before the servants and Big Jake were scheduled to return, David finished feeding the dogs the last of his special brand of chow. Like before, Max and Kilo jumped about the kitchen, wide-eyed overgrown poodles, yipping and whimpering wildly, waiting for those chunks of tender barbecued meat. "Okay you 2, he said, filling the 2 bowls with the last of Emma's stew, "enjoy. Boys, enjoy, that's the last of your hearty fucking bits." He laughed hysterically, then grimaced as he thought he saw one of Emma's bloated eyeballs turn and stare up at him from the dog's bowl before Max quickly snapped it up, chewed, then swallowed it. "Jesus," he muttered, watching in horrid fascination. It was over. His daily routine of soaking the remaining bones for the day in gasoline through the day, and watching them burn to dust overnight in the powerful gas flames was complete. She was gone. Everything was his now, even the dogs were his, and as he watched them eat he started to laugh again. He took a deep relaxing breath. She was finally gone. David was free, his own man, finally. He was looking forward to a nice relaxing unstressed evening. Tomorrow evening he would place her chair next to the barbecue pit with her bones, and burn the entire place to the ground, barely escaping with his life. David woke from a nightmare in the middle of the night. It was Emma and she was in the house, downstairs somewhere. She had the butcher knife and she was coming for him. "Let's eat, boys," she was saying. David bolted up in bed, drenched in a cold sweat, stifling a scream at his lips, his breathing labored. She couldn't be alive, no fucking way. He trembled. He remembered slicing her good, letting all the blood run out of her body, watching its crimson red disappear down the tub's drain, remembered how easily the butcher knife had pounded through skin, bone, tendons, and muscle. He looked around the bedroom searching for Max and Kilo, somehow wanting those animals next to him. "Max!" he called out, almost whispering in the dark. Silence. "Kilo," he said, raising his voice slightly. The door to the bedroom was ajar. Obviously. The dogs were roaming the house, doing their jobs. He laid back down, sucked in a deep gasp of air, let it out. The nightmare had been so real, he could have swore he heard Emma's voice, coming from the kitchen. He had to check it out, dream or no dream. He reached under his pillow for the 8mm, got out of bed, turned on the light and headed for the door. When he opened it he was surprised to see Max lying on the other side looking up at him. "There you are," he said, feeling a little better. "Come on, let's go downstairs, boy," he said, switching on the hallway light on his way down. Max, however, didn't move. His cold canine eyes only stared up at him intensely. "Okay, suit yourself," he said, slowly making his way down the stairs, hoping that at least Kilo was down there somewhere. When he reached the bottom, he felt a presence behind him, something pressing, something dangerous, and when he glanced back up the stairs, Max was standing on the landing looking down at him. David thought he could hear Max gently growling. "Oh my God," he whispered to himself, trying not to look frightened, and continued on his way to the kitchen. He wondered what had gotten into Max all of a sudden. He certainly couldn't be hungry. He suppressed a smile. "David." David's throat knotted up, his muscles froze and the hair along the nape of his neck bristled. It was definitely Emma's voice coming from the kitchen. He was at a loss to explain it. It was impossible, he had killed her. He wasn't dreaming now, he was certain of it. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, waving the 8mm in front of him. "Who's there?" he blurted, forcing himself to take another step towards the opened kitchen door. "I've got a gun," he said, wondering if Emma were really there. What in God's name would he see, a vision of her before or after he butchered her? Silence. As he stepped through the doorway he hit the light switch and the darkened kitchen became bright. At first it seemed empty to him, but at the far end where the pantry led to the back door and the barbecue pit, he spotted Kilo. For an instant he relaxed. "Oh, it's you," he said. Kilo sat quite still on his haunches, pointed ears fully erect. He didn't look friendly now, was beginning to growl. Starting from a low, gently purring type of sound, to a full menacing roll as his canine expression changed. "You bastard," Kilo said to him, eyes blazing. Emma's eyes now, Emma's voice. David froze in terror. He could see that Kilo's teeth were bared, the fur across his muzzle folded back in waves of vibrating wrinkles that exposed large vicious canine ivory. In an instant Kilo threw himself at him. David fired but missed and couldn't get off a second shot in time as the weight of the animal slammed into him and Kilo's massive jaws found his groping hand. The dogs had been trained to disarm a man. "Oh God," he blurted. "Kilo, no," he said, screaming, falling back against the kitchen door as Kilo clenched down on his wrist, biting hard. "Kilo. No," he screamed as the gun fell to the floor and the animal dragged him away from it. David struggled in vain, but couldn't get Kilo's jaws off his wrist, the excruciating pain preventing him from using his other arm to pick up the gun, and he noticed that Max was on the other side of the door now, growling and barking wildly, trying to break into the kitchen with his own deadly jaws snapping the air. David managed to finally get to his feet, feeling the warm crimson running from his arm as Kilo's massive jaws bit down harder and continued to ravage him. Behind him the door bucked as Max began to throw himself against it. Arg fuck. He screamed in pain, hearing a crunch at his wrist. He tried desperately and repeatedly to pry Kilo off of his arm, but every attempt failed. The dog's powerful jaws would only rebite harder at a new spot, thrashing back and forth. Blows to his head seemed only to anger him more, and when he tried to kick Kilo he lost his balance, almost letting Max inside. He couldn't reach the gun. He screamed as he felt and heard something snap in his wrist, followed by an eruption of more pain. Kilo began to thrash harder after tasting blood, and David could see his hand flopping around like a rag doll. God damn it, he cried as something new began to tear loose inside his wrist, and for the first time in his life he experienced real pain as Kilo now began to gnaw on exposed muscle, nerves, and tendons. A bolt of hot acid shot up his arm to his spine, and for an instant his eyes glazed over as white ivory tore away flesh. Kilo wasn't just biting him or holding him until someone came around. The dog had become crazed in some feeding frenzy, and it wasn't just trying to kill him. David stared around the kitchen wildly. He had to get to the gun. He knew the moment he moved away from the door, he'd have two of the wild animals to worry about. He could hear the dogs out in the kennel howling at the disturbance. The pantry door across the kitchen was open. It was only 40 feet away from him. The gun was about halfway, but it was the longest 20 feet he could ever imagine. To reach it would mean to drag 95 pounds of thrashing Kilo all the way there before Max had the chance to join in. He didn't think he could make it. Suddenly something else in his wrist snapped, and as he screamed looking down, he could see what was left of his mangled hand being torn away from his wrist as nerve endings erupted acid hot. A few white tendons glistening with crimson seemed to try and hold on, then they too popped like wet rubber bands, leaving behind only a white bony stump pumping red crimson as Kilo clamped down and yanked his precious prize away. Ag, shit, screeched David as Kilo never let go of his severed hand. He clutched his bloodied stump and made a run for the gun, was surprised when Kilo didn't chase him. Max, however, came crashing through the kitchen doorway, eyes blazing, teeth mashing at his heels, and managed to catch him just as he reached the pistol. David felt the second pair of jaws snap shut on his calf and begin to thrash about and tear flesh. He screamed, but he had the gun. Fuck you and your dogs, Jake. He screamed, emptying the entire clip into Max before the massive jaws finally released him and Max slumped over. David closed the pantry door and collapsed against it, sobbing wildly. He grimaced, sinking down to the floor, moaning wildly in pain and terror. It couldn't be happening, realized he was bleeding to death, and dared to look at his bleeding stump missing a hand, then cried. He felt cold mingling with pain throughout his body, but managed with one hand to remove his belt and fashion a tourniquet, before he passed out against the door. David opened his eyes to the dull throbbing from his bloodied stump. He was reminded this was no dream as he looked at it and wondered how long he was out. Fucking dogs, he sobbed like a child, should have killed you bastards along with Emma, he screamed, you fucking bitch, he blurted, forcing himself to stand up on one leg, whimpering as renewed pain bubbled through his torn body. Look what Jake's dogs did to me. He looked through the window to the kitchen and could see Kilo still gnawing on what was left of his hand, cracking white bones now. Licking them carefully, savoring every flavorful tidbit, stripping the delicious pink flesh from the bones and saving the fresh bone marrow for last. Tears streamed down David's terrified face. Suddenly, to his surprise and horror, Max was getting up, red crimson pouring from 8 bullet holes. David's heart skipped another beat. How could that animal be alive? He looked again carefully and saw what he thought was the living remains of Emma's charred head somehow grafted onto Max's bullet-torn body. Jesus fucking Christ, he gasped as the Emma Max thing smiled at him. Its tendons pulling up on Emma's burned facial muscles, dog stump wagging, bullet holes still draining crimson. David, it screeched to him, it was Emma's voice. No. He yelled back crying like a baby, no. David, it screeched to him again, these dogs need to be fed. No Emma, please, he blurted, crying hysterically. Emma, look what Kilo did to my goddamned hand, he raised his bloodied stump. Hardy bits my ass. The Emma Max thing said, erupting in laughter. David felt he might still escape this horrible nightmare. The rear door of the pantry led outside. Suddenly the barbecue pit outside the pantry flared up and came to life magically like a huge furnace, and he turned to glance at it when his heart almost stopped. The pit suddenly exploded into flames that quickly engulfed the kitchen, and beyond the roaring flames of the barbecue pit he could see the silhouettes of the kennel dogs running from the kennels up to the main house. Impossible, somehow all 10 dogs had escaped from their kennels and were coming for him. God help me, somebody please help me. He screamed frantically. Kilo, now finished with his morsel, threw himself against the pantry door with renewed energy, wildly, his blood-stained muzzle smashed at the kitchen window, fangs bared, breaking glass, and when David turned back to look at the barbecue pit again, there was the Emma Max thing jumping around frantically in the golden glow of the fire, half barking, whimpering wildly, wagging his stubby little tail, like one of those hungry, ridiculous-looking poodle dogs. Blood still pouring out of the bullet holes, and behind him the remaining kennel dogs still approaching. Let's eat, boys, said the Max Emma thing in Emma's voice, which was the last thing he remembered before the dogs arrived, ravished, and ate him alive as the fire burned the mansion to the ground around them. David's screams in the night were answered by no one. Epilogue. In the days that followed, forensics discovered some of the human remains of David Martin, along with the dogs mingled in the ash of the gutted house. The official account indicated David may have been using gasoline to start the barbecue. When fumes ignited the can and engulfed the entire pantry and house, they all perished. Big Jake stood beside the footprint of where the house once sat and the outline of empty kennels, the only remaining structure of the grounds, and looked over at the huge pile of black ash, concrete, and melted steel. He shook his head. Too bad about the house, he muttered. Next to him from the stretch limo emerged Emma Hiller in her immaculate wheelchair, zipping around to the front of the Benz. I don't mind so much, she smiled. I'd hate to live in this fucking house after what's happened. Emma then got up from her wheelchair and stretched. God, I hate sitting in this thing, turning to Jake and embracing him. Thank you, JT. Catherine, please sit down. Besides, the world will soon know we found that spinal surgeon your sister had been looking for, and hell, by next month the world will know Emma Hiller can move her legs again and start to walk. He smiled. Catherine Cinnamon, who killed her pimp with a baseball bat 25 years ago, sat back down in Emma's chair and stared at the Pacific Ocean beyond the house grounds. Her identical twin sister Emma Hiller had let her rot in prison for 8 extra years when their family trust couldn't find her. Emma cleverly took her identity and her inheritance. If it weren't for Jake, Catherine might have gone back to turning tricks on the street after her release from prison a few months earlier, never knowing who she really was. The unexpected murder of Emma by David made it a perfect opportunity, and with a little theatrics provided by Jake and Catherine, David fell right into their plan. If anything went wrong, his special camera feed stored safely in the internet cloud clearly showed that David and Emma tried to kill each other, clearly showed David butchering her and feeding her to the dogs. Jake didn't think Emma deserved to be fed to dogs, and he would have saved her if he could, but it was too late when he arrived to find the bloody scene and David unconscious in the pantry. Catherine Cinnamon A. K. Catherine Hiller stared out at the Pacific Ocean sitting in her sister's chair. She turned and looked up at Jake with a smile. Just call me Emma.